back then, but you don't need help with Azure now. You've been helping people learn their Azure skills and become pretty deep Azure expert. So it's really great to be able to tap you from all the way in Texas for a
Yes,
for an event. So the other side of the COVID coin is it's nice to be able to have the speakers come from anywhere.
Yeah.
So without further ado, join me in welcoming Doug. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. I will tell you that by far some of the most fond memories I have is taking the train or the bus down to Boston for the day to go and hang out with the tech community down there, go to a meetup, do something at Nerd. Those were my salad days, and I wouldn't trade it for a thing. And it's a large part of the success that I've been able to have. So in no small part, I thank the community for helping me get to where I am. So as Bill had indicated, my name is Doug Vanderweide. I'm a director of information technology at Avanade. Avanade is a joint venture of Microsoft and Accenture. We are about 50,000 people worldwide. They're trying to hire another 20,000 people in the next 2 years. We are always hiring Microsoft talent. So if you're kind of bored in your role today, if you know anything about the Microsoft stack, if you have knowledge around Dynamics or SharePoint or anything like that, and you think you'd like to learn more about Avanade, feel free to reach out to me. I have been working in Azure for about 10 years, as Bill noted. I got started at my old newspaper group. We got $50,000 worth of Azure credits as part of a Store Simple deal. And ever since that moment, I became an Azure developer. My actual skill set goes back quite a time. I came up through the ranks as a .NET and SQL Server open source developer for quite some time. As Bill indicated, I'm originally from Maine. I've been in Texas for the last 5 years, and I have a bunch of certifications as well. So just so you know, I have a general understanding of which end of Azure pounds the nail. As we go through this, the thing that I really want to talk about today is setting up some of why we're going to have this conversation around Azure policy and using automation to enforce a tagging strategy. And I think the first thing that you need to understand in order to get to why this is important is the concept of governance, right? And governance is ultimately the ability to be able to identify, measure, and control all the assets you have deployed. So what is it's things like, what is this thing? Where is it in the world? What does it do? Who owns it? Who controls it? What relies upon this thing? What does it cost? Is it operating efficiently? So on and so forth. All of the things that go into making sure that I'm not being wasteful, either in terms of cost or being wasteful in terms of effort. Also things along the lines of who's going to pay for all of this, how are we going to make sure that we're doing this as well as we can. That's governance in a nutshell. And it's especially true that in large organizations, governance is a significant challenge for them. Usually speaking, a large IT organization, and by this I mean like a Fortune 500, Fortune 100 company, they tend to be in multiple clouds. So they're going to be in Azure. They're probably going to be in AWS. They probably have colos someplace. So they have data centers somewhere out there. They're running private clouds. They may be using VMware. They may have rack space presence, so on and so forth. And when they are in Azure, they tend to be using multiple subscriptions. They have very complex subscription hierarchies. Sometimes they have subscriptions that are specific for dev test. Sometimes they have subscriptions that are broken out for regional concerns or by business unit. Sometimes they use the hub and spoke model, where certain shared services and certain central networking assets are in subscriptions, and everything branches off from there. And I should mention this as well, folks. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any point, or go ahead and electronically raise your hand. I'll try to keep an eye on that and answer any questions you might have. Another thing that tends to be true of most large IT organizations, most organizations that are broad in terms of their total operational footprint, multiple divisions across the world, that sort of thing, is they all tend to use what's called a chargeback model. And what that means is the operational cost of their IT estates, the actual cost of delivering the IT services that they're using in Azure and other places, gets billed back to a specific business unit. So that business unit has an IT budget, and they need some means to track what the spend against that IT budget is, so that they can charge the business unit and make sure that that business unit isn't exceeding the capacity they've been allotted. Also, in most large IT operations, you tend to see that the model that they use for operating is an IT servicing model. So the IT department doesn't actually own anything in the IT estate. They don't own the computers. They don't own the data center. They don't own the cloud presence. They're not ultimately even really responsible for any of that stuff. The decision of what gets created and what gets bought and where it goes and all those other things, they might be an advisor, but they're not a decider. The business units decide what kind of IT they're going to have, what kind of programs they're going to run, how those programs are going to be hosted, where they're going to be hosted. So the IT unit is really just a servicing organization. They keep the lights on. They're basically digital janitors, as it were, right? They're there to maintain the inventory, to keep things running, to enforce, some guardrails, to, impose discipline on the operations. But ultimately, what gets done in the IT world doesn't really belong to the IT department in most large organizations. It belongs to specific business units. And then finally, and this is where this question of Azure policy and tagging comes in, most large organizations have a lot of different tools for a lot of different solutions, right? So SIEM, Security Incident and Event Management, ITSM, IT Service Management, ITIL, Information Technology Information, CMDB, Configuration Management, IPAM, IP Management. They have all these different tools that do different things for them in terms of, being able to control their environments as well as monitor them. It is the very rare large organization, for example, that uses Azure Monitor as its sole pane of glass to look at Azure. Generally speaking, they want to have a unified pane of glass. They're using something like Grafana, or they're using something like something like that, to have a much broader implementation of their monitoring solutions and their alerting solutions. They will have very complex implementations of ServiceNow, for example, and everything that they need to know has to basically come into everything that they're doing in the IT world, regardless of where it is. If it's in AWS, if it's in Azure, if it's in VMware at some co-location facility or data center they own, all that information, generally speaking, needs to report to the same places so that they have the ability to see everything in one place in terms of their operations. And I'm sorry, I've lost focus on my advancer. Let me get that back. All right. So that's where tagging comes in. So tagging, for those of you who aren't familiar with tagging in Azure, it's basically key value pairs that can be assigned to most assets. There are a few assets in Azure that you can't tag, but for the most part, pretty much anything you're going to encounter that racks a charge is going to be something you can tag. And a tag is basically a means of storing metadata about a resource that's useful for understanding its context. The real value in tagging at the end of the day, especially for large organizations, is that using Azure native tools, using tools you can build yourself, bespoke tools, or using third-party tool sets such as ServiceNow and the like, you can usually retrieve the tags on an asset when you're trying to call for that resource. So I can set up an integration, for example, in ServiceNow or some other catalog service that basically says, when I pull the information about this particular virtual machine, for example, tell me the tags that are on that virtual machine. And when I do that, I'm doing it probably through the REST API that Azure has, and I'm getting that information back and I'm able to store it. And therefore I can use those tags to help catalog that item for various business concerns I might have. The real value of tags at the end of the day is that they exist outside of, and therefore they extend the subscription and resource group hierarchy, right? Also management groups. And for those of you who are familiar, very large organizations, when they buy Azure, they don't buy pay-as-you-go subscriptions. They tend to have enterprise agreements with Microsoft. And what an enterprise agreement is it's a way for that large organization to pay for all their Microsoft stuff in one place. So all their Office 365, all of their Dynamics, all of their SQL Server licenses, all of their Windows desktop licenses, and all of their Azure stuff tends to be part of what's called an enterprise agreement, which is a all rolled up price that Microsoft gives that customer. As part of that process, there's additional reporting planes called departments and accounts that they can use as well. But again, the beauty of a tag is it exists outside all of these hierarchical solutions. So from, it's basically enterprise agreement, department account, then subscription, then resource group. Tags would live outside that ecosystem. And therefore, they extend the ability to track assets because I don't have to worry about where they are in that logical hierarchy. So we know what governance is now. It's the ability to keep control over your stuff, especially to understand what it is, why it's there, what it's supposed to be doing for you, who owns it, et cetera, et cetera. We've established that it is difficult to keep a wrestle on that, especially if you are a large organization that has stuff everywhere in multiple different types of places and that need all of that information to report to external systems. So our ability to govern those assets, especially for large organizations, can be a challenge. And there's some ways that most people tend to solve that problem, at least at least as a smaller organization, right? So we can have a naming standard. And depending upon how we name things, that name can tell us where that asset is in the world, what its purpose is, what kind of thing it is, if it's a virtual machine, if it's a network, that sort of thing. We can use subscriptions as well to group our assets by purpose or business unit, right? So theoretically, we can have a subscription, for example, that maybe our subscription strategy is every application we have goes to a particular subscription. Maybe we have a strategy that's a hub spoke. Again, we have a central subscription for all shared services, and then every other department gets its own subscription, or every other geographical area gets its own subscription. So all the stuff in East US is in one subscription, and all the stuff in West US is in another. And typically, we see resource groups used to manage assets that are on the same life cycle. So any solution, any workload, any application that I have that's running in Azure, it's very typical that all the things that are necessary to provide that application, the databases, the virtual machines, the networks, the firewalls, so on and so forth, all tend to live in one or two resource groups that are related to that particular solution. And finally, again, we can use regional separations to help structure business units. But the challenge with that approach, especially as you get larger, especially as you become a bigger organization, is it doesn't scale well, right? The challenge if you're going to have there are a lot of enterprises out there that have hundreds, if not thousands, of applications. You can't have hundreds or thousands of subscriptions. It just becomes unmanageable. There are tons of organizations out there that are deploying all the time. They can't have every single asset that's related to a particularly large operation, for example, like perhaps their enterprise planning solution, something that they're using to basically allocate staff and materials. That's probably too broad, too large a thing for them to put in a single resource group. They need multiple resource groups because there's too many moving parts. They can't define it as a single deployment. Same thing is true of regional approaches. Some organizations, they have multiple regions for one particular business unit. One business unit may very well span the globe. So again, what tagging does, because it's outside of these restrictions, it's outside of these hierarchies, tagging allows us to identify what assets are doing without being restricted to any of these logical hierarchies that exist, such as regions, resource groups, subscriptions, and even naming of asset or naming conventions. So what are the kinds of tags we tend to see large organizations specifically, but organizations in general? What kind of tags do they tend to put on assets? There's actually some guidance on the doc site for Azure under their framework part, which I'll try to get links to for you in the meetup. That talks about typical tags that are advised for most organizations, but typically what you'll see in a large organization is specifically a cost center tag. Especially any organization that has a chargeback model that says, hey, business unit, you're financially responsible for everything we deploy on your behalf in Azure. You need to pay for that thing. It has to come off your budget. By far the most easy way to keep track of that is to simply assign a cost center a tag to an asset so that you know who's racking that charge. Same thing is true for most organizations to have an owner. The owners, again, especially depending upon how broad an application is, it's not unusual for a single application to have multiple people who own parts of that application. There may be a DB team that owns the underlying databases, for example, in the website. There may be another team that owns the firewall. There may be another team in the networking concerns. There may be another team that is responsible for actually providing the web servers. There may be another team that's actually responsible for the DevOps part of pushing the code there. There may be multiple teams with multiple moving parts that all are part of a single application, and therefore having an owner tag on individual assets helps keep straight which team owns this part of this solution. You'll see versions, you'll see termination dates, especially for assets that are put out there. Some organizations will intentionally tag assets for a particular termination date and automate the process of destroying them. Most are going to apply a business criticality tag. They want to make sure that they can audit any mission critical system is being backed up or is being supported in a way that the business can continue to run if there's an incident. Almost all of them also use a data classification tag. Almost all of them say, hey, we want to make absolutely certain that we are able to identify the information systems that are holding confidential information or personally identifiable information so that in the event of a data breach, we can quickly identify places that we need to lock down. The summary of this is the next large organization that was 100% tagging coverage on all of its assets will be the first. I've talked with dozens of businesses, extremely large organizations every single year. None of them have this right, okay? And that's not a bad thing. The reason why none of them have it right, in short, is because there's no efficient means of enforcing both the presence and the quality of a tag in Azure. For example, one of the challenges in Azure is that tags are case sensitive. So if I spell owner with a capital O in one place and owner with a lowercase o in another place, those are two different keys in the Azure tagging world. And so therefore it may look to me like I've got better coverage than I do, but in truth, when I query, I need to make sure that my case sensitivity and my spacing sensitivity are addressed in the key of that tag so I can actually pull all the information I'm expecting. And then again, additionally, the challenge is for most of the things, without some means of insisting that the tag be there, a tag is not required to deploy an asset in Azure. An asset can be deployed without tags. And what tends to happen is, even with the best of intents, organizations, even highly automated organizations, don't have a means of saying, oops, you forgot the tag. That's where Azure Policy comes in. So what is Azure Policy? Azure Policy is basically a way to allow you to enforce and audit deployment compliance for Azure assets. So is this thing that I'm putting in Azure correctly configured according to my business rules and my technical requirements? That's what Azure Policy does. It audits or it views the deployment as it happens, and it ensures that the asset as it's being deployed complies with those requirements that you set out. An Azure Policy can be applied at multiple scopes. So it can be applied to a management group. For those of you who aren't familiar, management groups are basically a way to associate both identity or role-based access control and policies to multiple subscriptions at once. It's also possible to apply a policy directly to a subscription. That's what we'll be doing today in our demo. And it's also possible to apply a policy at the resource group level. We can further group our policies together to a common outcome, such as an initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. And then finally, there's multiple means of enforcement available to you in an Azure policy. One thing you can do is just outright reject the deployment. Hey, user, you forgot to add this tag, or you gave me a tag value that's incorrect. I'm going to reject the deployment outright, go back and try again. Another thing I can do is I can say, well, you sent me this deployment, it does not have a cost center tag on it, so I'm going to automatically assign a generic cost center tag to it. So at least I have something. May not be right, but at least I'll have something that looks correct. And then finally, the thing you can do is you can audit that deployment. So you can have the policy say, I just deployed this person just deployed this virtual machine. I went ahead and created it. They did forget to give me a cost center tag. Now what I'm going to do is tell MAW. I'm going to send off a message to a queue. I'm going to raise an alarm that basically says, hey, when this guy deployed this asset, he forgot to add that tag. So what are some typical Azure policies that you see out there? Very common for most organizations is that there's a regional restriction, right? We're not going to allow you to deploy this virtual machine to South Africa because we don't do business in South Africa. Also very common is policies that say don't deploy expensive SKUs, right? So you cannot go out and deploy that giant M series VM with 64 cores because it costs $1,000 a minute, $1,000 an hour to run. We're just not going to let you make those things. You can, for example, enforce encryption at rest. So maybe you have some SQL databases. You want to deploy those databases. You want to make sure that everything that you have is all that data is encrypted at rest by default. You could certainly create a policy that says anytime you create a new SQL Server PaaS service, make sure that encryption at rest is turned on. And then the other thing you can do as well is for all your public endpoints, enforce HTTPS. So no HTTP traffic to that public endpoint. It has to come over via HTTPS. More advanced stuff is ensuring that your virtual machines are set for backups, either that a backup agent is present on the VM or it's actually using the Azure backup solution. Requiring network security groups anytime a new subnet is created. So you can't just come out and baldly create a new subnet. If you create a new subnet, it has to have a network security group associated with it. Same thing is true for, again, providing certain default settings. So maybe not necessarily a tag default value, but maybe, for example, one of the things you want to do is say anytime that a new network security group is created, it needs to have a specific rule in place. That rule needs to block any traffic on 3389. And you want to insist on that rule being present in the NSG. You can go ahead and create a policy that basically says, and if you don't see a rule for 3389 that's a deny rule, you will automatically add that deny rule for 3389. And then again, as we talked about here, you can check for certain tags. As we look at today's demo, one of the things we'll be able to see and I'll be able to show you is there's a long list of built-in best practice policies that are already present in every Azure subscription. Most of them are in audit, which is why you tend not to run up against them and see them as a bad thing. But I can show you what some of those policies are and how you can turn them into enforcement policies to prevent some potentially dangerous practices. Okay. That's a lot of stuff. I'm going to take a quick pause. Anybody have any questions before we start talking about the nuts and bolts of what we're going to be looking at today for actual hands-on keyboard stuff? Okay, so what are the parts of Azure of an Azure policy? Well, the first thing you have to have is a definition. That is, what is the condition that needs to be met, and what do you want to do to ensure that that condition is met every single time you deploy an asset? The next thing you need to do is provide the definition. In some cases, you need to provide values that describe what's allowed. So for example, you may very well have, and what we'll be looking at today in our demo is, we're going to be applying a cost center tag to our assets when they get deployed, and we're going to restrict the possible values of that tag to only certain values. So that's a definition object. The values that are allowed is one of the definition objects that you would supply. The next thing is an assignment. So you have a policy that is going to require a particular state. We have the allowed values for that particular state. Now we need to assign that. We need to assign that policy and give it a specific scope. So we need to take the policy definition that we defined. That then needs to be assigned to either a management group, a subscription, or a resource group. That's called the assignment. There are also initiatives. As we described before, initiatives are a grouping of policy definitions for assignment purposes. So for example, I may have multiple policies that define the kinds of tags that I need to have on an asset. I need to have 4 or 5 different required tags. Every single asset needs to have them. I would probably define that in 4 or 5 different policies, and then I would group those together in an initiative that would be my tagging policy initiative. there is the ability to make exclusions. So another thing I can do is define, I want this policy to apply except in these particular cases. And basically you can create an exclusion therefore that excludes specific assets from policy definition when after it's been assigned. Finally, there's a remediation. So I've been speaking about policies as runtime solutions, right? That every single time I'm going to make a deployment, I can use a policy to ensure that that deployment is compliant with my rules and requirements as defined in my policies. But I can also create what's called a remediation. And what a remediation does is it says, it is possible that somehow, it's certainly possible that prior to implementing the policy, you have some assets that are not compliant. They do not comply with the policy that you've just defined. You may have a bunch of stuff in Azure already, for example, that doesn't have a cost center tag. A remediation plan allows you to basically say, for those assets that are already existing, I want you to go and apply this solution, this fix, to all of the things that don't comply with this new policy. It's also theoretically possible, although it shouldn't happen, it does occasionally happen, that through one way or another, you see some configuration drift on your assets that Azure policy doesn't catch because it's not technically a redeployment. It's especially true with virtual machines. Sometimes you add things to virtual machines or make changes to them internally that have a fundamental effect on their overall configuration that tends to make them drift. You can use a remediation plan also to spot this kind of weird drift that doesn't completely fall into the definition of a redeployment. All right. So what I'm going to do is show you now how to deploy an Azure policy from a PowerShell. I also in a template. I wanted to do this with Azure DevOps, but my Azure DevOps instance ate my homework. So we're going to be doing this the old-fashioned way with PowerShell and ARM templates. I also do recognize that Microsoft would like people to start using Bicep. I actually kind of like Bicep. It's very YAML-y. If you work a lot in Azure DevOps, you will like the fact that Bicep is pretty YAML-y. The challenge I have is that I haven't worked with it enough to do this quickly, and I didn't give myself enough time to do the demo. So ARM templates in PowerShell it is. What we're looking at on screen right now is basically an ARM template, and this ARM template is going to define the policy. So this is a policy definition ARM template. And as you can see, I've got the schema set for this subscription deployment template scope. So I'm going to be putting this right at the subscription level. Normally I would do this at a management group level, and I don't want to get overly nuanced about why I like management groups over subscriptions, but if we have time, we can have that conversation. Normally, I would put this at a management group. For this demo, I'm going to be doing it at the subscription level. As you can see, the cleverly just named Microsoft authorization policy definitions is the scope, is the type of thing we're going to be deploying. I'm going to give it the name of required tag billing identifier. Normally, I would not put this in a template. I would pass it in as a parameter. Again, for this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and give it a hard-coded name. The API version tells the API which version of this definition to use as it creates the thing. These are just basically a friendly name for required billing identifier tag. You'll see that in just a moment. I have to specify that this is a custom policy because it is a policy that I wrote. This description is very helpful. You can see it in the portal. I'll show that to you in a bit. The other thing is that it's also going to have a category. So you can categorize your individual policies with this thing. In this case, I actually stole this from another project I was working on for a customer that had a bunch of stuff they wanted to make, they wanted to put policies on. One of the things they wanted was required tags. Having this category piece is something you can filter on in the portal. It's really helpful for seeing what's in effect and what isn't in effect. This mode indexed basically means, I forget the exact definition, but basically the index mode is telling the deployment, listen, what you're going to do is go and iterate all of the items that this can be applied to, and you're going to make sure that it applies to them. That's an oversimplification of what it does, but good enough for now. Finally, I'm passing into as parameters this bill ID value. It's going to be an array, and basically what it's saying is when I get a bill ID, when you provide the billing code ID for this tag, it's going to have to be one of these three values. Right? You can't provide me anything else. So here's where we actually create the rule. It's a simple if statement. And what it basically says, if any of these conditions are true, then I'm going to deny the deployment. Okay, so if any of these things are true, then I'm going to deny the deployment outright. In this case, I'm saying there has to be a tag with the key of billing identifier. If that's not present, I'm going to reject the deployment. The other thing I'm going to reject the deployment for is if the tag named billing identifier doesn't have a value that's in this list. Okay? Any questions about this template before we move on and actually try to use it? Okie dokie. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and fire up PowerShell. Normally I would do this in the Cloud Shell, but for some reason I can't copy paste in the Cloud Shell today, or at the very least it's decided it's not going to be nice to me about it. So we will be using good old console PowerShell, and I will embiggen so you can see what this looks like. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is log in AZ account. I know there's a lot of different ways to log into an Azure account. I am using the AZ module for this. I believe there's a replacement on the horizon. I might be wrong about that, but definitely don't use Azure RM. That module is no longer with us. So, and again, I do know there's more than one way to log into Azure with this thing. I'm using, again, login AZ account just because it's familiar to me. So it'll take just a moment while I get prompted to log in. All right, I'm going to log in with my personal account. I don't actually know any of my passwords, so I have to go look it up. Bear with me just a moment. I use LastPass, by the way, to record my passwords. I don't know what you guys use, but I absolutely adore this thing. It couldn't get a thing done without it. So let me go back over here, paste that in, and I'm going to have to go ahead and enter my my code. So that is right here. No, thank you for asking, though. All right. 735724. All right. And it should dump me in, and I should be logged in. Okay. I'm also going to cheat and copy down the individual codes. I will give you guys this information as well. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and set a variable that contains the subscription ID I'm going to use, because I'm going to need that later in this process. So I set a variable sub ID that's just going to contain the GUID that you see right here for this thing. Did I do that right? Nope, that's the wrong GUID. I need this one right here. Well, that's a tenant ID. I apologize. This is the ID of my Azure tenant. That's the correct sub ID. My apologies. Okay. So the next thing I need to do is, normally I would not do this, but if you have more than one Azure subscription, this is a really useful commandlet. You can then set your context to be this particular subscription. So I'm going to use set AZ context. I'm being very specific in this case that this is the subscription I want to use. Okay, next thing I want to do is go ahead and add that template that we were just looking at. I have that template saved in an Azure storage account that's publicly accessible. I'm just going to go ahead and run the new AZ subscription deployment commandlet, which I'll show you before I execute it. Bear with me. All right. New AZ subscription deployment is telling Azure I want to go ahead and deploy at the subscription level. I have to provide a location, even though policies are not location based, they'll apply to the entire subscription regardless of where your assets are located. But as you know, you can't run a deployment without specifying a region that you're going to deploy to. And then finally, I'm just giving the template URI of the template that I was just showing you. So when I hit return, it'll take just a few seconds. And Azure's going to go ahead and create that. For me, and it's going to spit out basically information about that policy. So what I want to do now is look in the portal. We're going to look at Azure policy. In this case, I'm going to look at the definitions. Oh, by the way, getting into the Azure policy piece, getting into this view, to be able to manipulate anything in here, you need fairly advanced privileges. It wouldn't hurt to be an owner. If you're a contributor, you may or may not have certain permissions that are necessary to be able to look at this stuff. But what I'm going to do right in this case is I'm going to sort by type, and you can see I now have a custom policy named require billing identifier tag. And when I click on that, I can see the full definition of the policy. It looks very much like what I was just talking about. Again, in this case, I need to have a tag that's named billing identifier. That tag not only needs to be present, but the values that are in it need to be one of these allowed values. Let me be real clear about this. In the case of making a requirement, almost always you need to have one of these any of statements. It's very rare that you can pass to this thing just a list of values, then say the value that you're providing this tag have to be present. Usually Azure Policy is going to interpret that as the tag is optional, but if you provide the tag, it can only be one of these values. Without both these statements, you can't have a required tag. But if I got rid of this statement saying that the field needs to be present, if I went and deployed something without a billing identifier tag, it would accept that. If I deployed something with a billing identifier tag that said ABC123, it would reject it. Okay, let me back up one. All right, so there's our policy. It's available, but it's not being applied. Let me show you that. So I'm going to come over here to the storage account. I'm going to create a storage account. I'm going to name the storage account. We'll create a new resource group. We'll call it Boston Azure. And we'll give the storage account the name of just some random stuff. That should do it. I guess not. We'll go back there. That should take care of it. You can see that I can scroll all the way through this, even past tags to review and create. And I'm going to run my final validation and I pass. But I just created a policy that says, hey, I want this tag, this billing identifier tag on this asset, and it has to be one of these values. The reason that it doesn't work yet is because I haven't assigned it a scope. I haven't set its assignment. So that's going to be our next task. So let me come back up here and go back into my commandlets and back into PowerShell. Okay, so now I need to go ahead and create the policy assignment. To do that, my automation routine, and I realize that I'm running this by hand, but normally I would do this if I was going to automate this either with Azure Automation, which runs PowerShell scripts for you, or with a DevOps pipeline. So first thing I got to do is I just created this policy. I need to get that policy definition so I can actually assign it. So I'm going to set the value of that policy to be this. And if I go ahead and write output, that policy variable that is created, I get back the same information when I got it back. So this is an object with these values, parameters and values, right? Okay. So now what I want to do is go ahead and set the values that can be accepted. I know I did that in the policy, but for some reason, when you create the assignment allows you to override the allowed values. So I could create a subset of I could create a policy with a broad set of allowed values. I could then create an assignment that only allows a subset of those values. So I could have one subscription that says, you can give me any billing code. I could have another subscription that this applies to, and say, in this one, you can only use the billing codes that are appropriate to a particular department or something. And use the same policy, but a narrower definition of allowed values. So in this case, I need to create an array of all the allowed values. That's what that bill ID's variable is. And finally, I'm ready to go ahead and assign the policy. So now what I'm going to do is, again, run this commandlet. I could also do this with template. I have a template that I can show you that does this, but I prefer to do it this way. And this is how I would normally do it with an Azure automation solution is, I'm now just going to go ahead and run a policy assignment. This policy assignment is going to go ahead and pull the policy definition. So that policy variable that we just set, that's going to that's telling it this is the policy I want to assign. Scope tells me I'm going to assign it to this particular subscription at the subscription level. And the policy parameter object, again, is those values, these particular values that I'm going to allow to be passed in. So I hit return. Second, bingo, I've got an assignment. If I go back into the portal and I look at policy again, I can now see that I have assignments. There's my assignment, okay? In this particular case, what it's telling me is I'm going to have there's going to be a parameter provided that's bill ID. It's got to be one of those values that I specified, and then it's going to basically deny directly any deployment to the subscription that doesn't have one of those tags. Let me show you how this actually works when we try to actually use it. So now I'm going to go back and create a storage account again. Again, in this case, I will call the story. I'll just give some random gibberish for a name. I'm going to go next to advanced. Next. Uh-oh. My tags are not showing up there. It should show me as an error right there. Next, data protection. Next, tags. This should not have happened. Of course, this is how you know it's a live demo, is that it didn't actually work correctly. Oh, no, it didn't. It failed. Okay. So what should actually have happened here, let me refresh because maybe it's just the portal model. Normally what will happen here when you try to come and create a storage account is immediately after you provide this basic information, you should see a little red dot here appear next to tags, and it should tell you that, hey, you've got to apply tags. It's a requirement on this deployment. But we'll go right over here. We'll get right through, and you'll see that I get a validation fail. And the reason why it's validated failed is because it's disallowed by policy, right? And I can actually come over here and click on the policy and see the policy that I'm violating. If I were using DevOps or some other solution to pump or to pipe this information into, or to pipe this particular request into Azure, there's a strong possibility I would not get any warning in advance. That's why I would want to run some sort of test on it before I actually execute it. But in this case, if I come over here and I type in billing identifier, let me make sure that I've got that correct. I just want to make sure that I've got the name of the key of this correct before I get going. It's going to be billing identifier, capital B, capital I. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and provide billing identifier. I'm going to provide a value. In this case, I know that one of the values I have to provide is, this is one of the values I can provide. Actually, let me provide a wrong value first. So let's go ahead and call that like that. And I'll go ahead and review and create. And you'll see I fail again. And in this case, the reason I failed is because I provided a bad value. So what I'll do this time is go back one more step, and this time I'll provide an actual value that's allowed. So if I review and create, oh, I don't know why I'm not passing my validation.
You have to fix your name.
I'm sorry?
You have to fix the name. You mistyped.
Oh, I did a mistype. There you go. That's the reason why. There you go. Yep, you're correct. So actually, yeah, I don't know why I can't spell identifier correctly. Probably because I'm not wearing my reading glasses. There we go. There we go. Yeah. So in this case, let's go ahead and again and take that off, just so I still have the wrong name. When I validate, validation passed. It shouldn't have passed, but maybe because actually, I think in this case it will pass, but it will pass. But when I try to create, it will fail because I don't have a correct value. So it's passing because in this case I have, because it actually did take it. So if I come back here and rotate this entirely, there we go. Yeah, fails again. This time if I pass in a correct value, it will pass me and I can go ahead and create that object. So that's basically, in a nutshell, how I would begin the approach. That's the nuts and bolts of how applying a policy to Azure can allow me to ensure that a tag with a particular key and a particular set of values is allowed. What can policy do and not do out of the box? Okay, policy out of the box can require the presence of a configuration variable. That can be, again, a tag. It can be a particular region. It can be a particular SKU, that sort of thing. It can also restrict configuration inputs to specific values, like we just described. You can place a default configuration value where a value is not provided. So, for example, one of the things I could, in theory, do is say, if you don't have a cost center tag, I'm going to apply this default cost center to you. And finally, I can override a provided configuration value with a default value. So I can, for example, say, I don't care what you gave me for the value of cost center. Because you're deploying to this particular subscription, you will take a cost center that's associated with that subscription. What policy can't do natively is provide you with an option list. So you saw before that I said there are 3 different values that you can pass in as a billing identifier for this particular asset. What I can't do, what it won't do for you is like populate in the portal a pull down list of just those values. So it won't generate for you, even at deployment time, a list of values that are available to you to supply. It's also not good at complex if-then statements. So for example, if one of the things I wanted to do is say, well, if you're deploying to East US and this is a DSV3 series VM that you're deploying, then you need to give it a tag with a particular value. That's too complex for Azure policy out of the box to execute. The other thing it can't do is restrict configuration inputs to a range, right? So one of the things you can't say is, well, you got to have this tag called serial number, and that number has to be somewhere between 1 and 100. That's not something that Azure policy can do. It can't evaluate things as being in the middle of a range. So how do you get there? How do you typically work around those limitations? Most commonly, if you're going to use something like Azure DevOps, right? And what Azure DevOps is going to do is it's going to collect your runtime arguments, usually from some sort of configuration file. And that is, for example, if you're using Terraform, you're going to get that from your Terraform config or from your state file. If you're using just PowerShell or ARM templates, you may have a flat file or CSV or something like that, or an Excel file, or even a database that you might be pulling that information from. And the other thing you can do with something like Azure DevOps is pull from a configuration management database, from an ITSM system like ServiceNow, or from other APIs, right? So you could actually say, go give me some information, third-party service, and I will apply tags according to that. If you're using PowerShell scripts and to a lesser degree Azure Automation, generally speaking, you'll be prompted for that. Of course, the challenge with Azure Automation is while it's running PowerShell scripts for you, you can't really take user input, so you would need to have some sort of config file or the like. But basically, when you're using PowerShell scripts or the like, you can just write your PowerShell in a manner that the user is going to prompt with that information. Is user input when executing something automation? My opinion is yes. Others may disagree, and we can have a fulsome conversation around that if you'd like. Finally, Azure Functions or Logic Apps. Azure Functions more so, but Logic Apps to some degree are useful for solving the complex if-then interpretation, right? So saying when I'm deploying to East US and it's a DSV3 VM and it has this particular port open, then, or I want you to do some other thing, right? That is something that an Azure function can do for you quite easily. Same thing is true if you're pulling from external databases or other data sources. Azure Functions and Logic Apps are really good at that and saying, hey, go get me some information, spill it into an object for me so I can pull out the various parts I need in order to inform this deployment. Very useful at that. And that's basically you see them used in a helping level. It's very seldom you will see an Azure function used solely to deploy things, although I have seen that use case. I actually helped a client at one point. What they basically did was stand up boutique websites for their customers any single time that they onboarded them. And they had a completely automated solution to provision everything. We used an Azure function to do that. They basically just pushed a button and the function went and deployed everything that they needed, including pulling code from the right place and all that sort of stuff. So you can see functions and even Logic Apps occasionally running as standalone deployment solutions. More typically, they're used to support, especially things like Azure DevOps in terms of configuration. So to recap what we talked about today, large organizations face significant challenges when they're trying to govern their resources. In the public cloud, tagging is almost always, and this is true not just of Azure, but also of AWS and the like, it tends to be the most effective control plane for understanding and identifying assets, especially if you're a large organization with stuff everywhere. Very few organizations have sufficient tagging coverage to really be able to effectively govern their assets. That's where Azure Policy can come in. Azure Policy, when applied correctly, and as part of your deployment process, can really ensure that your tags are present and that they comply with your guidelines. Now, finally, deployment automation is typically required for this to work. It's very seldom, very rare that you're going to be able to make an Azure policy work if you're just freehanding it in the portal or with ad hoc PowerShell scripts like we were looking at. Again, I would never generally speaking, I would never call what we were looking at with the PowerShell scripts executed by hand as a mature process, but I would plug that into a pipeline, a DevOps pipeline, or even an Azure automation account, and consider that a fairly mature solution to the problem. That is all this presentation I had for you guys. I am happy to go over anything specific. I am happy to pop back into the portal and talk about policy and how it works. I did promise you that I would that we could look at the predefined policies in Azure, and we can do that as well. But I'll pause here, take any feedback or questions you've got.
So, hey, Doug, hopefully other folks will come off
Sure.
off mute and speak as they have questions. I have a comment/question. In what used to be known as the Azure Security Center, which is now Microsoft Defender for Cloud, that's also do you want to say anything about its use of policies?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see, so Azure Security, so if you look at your policy, if you go to your Azure subscription, any of them really, especially if you got a pay-as-you-go subscription, one that you like to play around in your little sandbox or the like, you will see in there this ASC default initiative, right? And this is an initiative, it's a grouping of policies, and you'll be able to see that in this, and this is what Bill's talking about, the Azure Security Center / Defender / whatever Microsoft has decided it should be branded this week, comes with a number of predefined policies. And these policies are informed by an organization called I think it's called the Coalition for Internet Security, CIS. They have a bunch of guidelines for what a reliable, safe cloud environment looks like. And these policies so the policies that you see in the ASC default configuration initiative in policy is based on those. And it contains things like, for example, enable threat detection capabilities. If we look at that policy, for example, one of the things you'll see is that it says, hey, you should totally be using Azure Defender and you don't have it enabled on this subscription. Well, okay, great hint. I'll go back and take a look at that and see what I can do about getting that fixed. Another thing, but more commonly, you'll see things along the lines of, let's take a look. Secure cloud services with network controls, right? Which in this case, it says we're compliant, right? In this case, the reason why I have secure network controls is I don't have any networks. But in this particular case, what it's saying is you should have private endpoints for any Azure service that supports private link in order to be able to provide private access to the resource. And you should disable or restrict public access network, public service access to public access to the service. I take a little bit of umbrage at that. It's not always true, but it's a good guideline. It is generally true that if you're going to be in a network environment, you should probably be protecting your stuff from public access, especially if it's not meant to be public. But I'm also a big believer, as an old school developer, a big believer in APIs and microservices and public endpoints, and identity is the new control plane and all that other stuff. And I'll talk your damn ear off about that, so don't get me started. But yeah, so there are a bunch of policies that are here in Azure that are available to you. The thing you'll notice again when we look at them under the assignments, when we look at how those policies are assigned, you'll see by far most of them are either disabled or they are in audit if not exists mode, or they're in audit mode. Audit if not exists mode basically says, for example, in this case, one of the things they're saying is you shouldn't use management. Well, not that one. That's not a great example, but okay. So here's one that says basically, if you're going to deploy a virtual machine scale set or a virtual machine to Azure, it should have the log analytics agent installed on it so that Azure Security Center can monitor it. That's probably a good piece of advice, but not for every organization. Some organizations like to use third-party tools, Symantec or the like, to monitor their assets and keep track of keep track of how well they're running and whether or not they're secure. Audit if not exists basically says, well, okay, if you deploy this virtual machine and it doesn't have a log analytics agent on it for the purpose of Azure Security Center, I'm just going to make a note. I'm just going to stick a note off someplace. And again, one of the things that that note can do is surface an event. So I can capture the fact that this virtual machine was deployed without the Azure Security Center agent. I can get that hooked via the Event Hub. Through the Event Hub, in turn, I can trigger some sort of automated workflow that says something like, well, go put the agent on it, or says something like, well, go send a note to mom and tell on this machine for coming here without the stuff it's supposed to have, that sort of thing. Most organizations, again, this is probably not, you could change the mode of this from audit, if not exist, to deny. You would probably create quite a few enemies in your IT staff and your user base, especially if you change audit policies to deny policies right off the bat. It's very often the case that that people mean well, but they don't have the maturity or the ability to deploy assets that are 100% compliant, especially if they have a new policy. So what most organizations do is implement a policy with audit, and you can see where the violations come, basically by looking at this compliance report. So in this case, I can see I've got some stuff that's non-compliant. If I click on it, I can see right here, what are the things that are not compliant? I can actually drill in and it will tell me the assets that are not compliant. So it's, and I believe it is, it's right here. So there's a way to actually pull this information as well. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but you can pull the information from this of the assets that are not compliant. You'll see that most of these things that I'm not compliant with right now are high level. Like this data protection one, you don't have any sort of implementation of a firewall or any other sort of data exfiltration monitoring on your subscription. Well, that's true, but that's because I don't have anything in it. So again, I can identify that the assets are non-compliant. I can see what's not there, and I can actually go ahead and see the things that are not correct and do something about them from here. It's actually easier to do this from the Security Center itself. So.
And Doug, thank you. That was excellent. Bringing the context there. What is the mechanism through which Azure allows all these policies to be grouped as a unit, because they're all under this ASC default thing?
Yeah, so that's an initiative. So when we look at policies, again, that's basically what's called an initiative. In this particular case, I'll go back over here to definitions. In this case, what I'll do is I will filter down for initiatives. So, and when I do that, I should see, come on, give me the initiative. Oh, so here's the initiative. So like I'm sorry, didn't mean to click on that. So for example, here's an initiative that is the NIST SP 800-171 R2 initiative. This basically implements all of the recommendations that are in the NIST 800-171 recommendation. And again, you'll see that most of them in this case are in audit mode. We do have a couple that are in modify mode. In other words, what it will do is it will automatically apply a system managed identity on a virtual machine that doesn't have any, for example, right? In this particular case, the assignment right here of ASC default contains all of these initiatives. So when I create these initiatives, these groupings of all my policies, I then assign them to the subscription. It is this ASC default assignment that contains all of these policies. So in each one of these initiatives is a policy, or in each one of these initiatives is multiple policies. Within this assignment are multiple initiatives. So they appear grouped as a single thing, even though they're all interrelated. Or rather, even though they are all addressing different requirements of my governance plan.
And so just like you can assign an individual policy, create a policy assignment to some resource scope like a subscription.
Yeah.
You could apply the initiative with the same mechanism?
Yes, absolutely. So, and I can do that. Typically, the way I would do that if I was automating this solution end to end, right? So if I was automating this end to end, let's suppose I'm using Azure DevOps. If I'm using the raw DevOps product out of the box, and I'm not going to bring in any third-party tools, the way I would do that assignment, both create the policy add the policy to an initiative, and then apply the initiative with an assignment to a subscription or a management group or the like. The way I would do that is with PowerShell. So in Azure DevOps, I would basically call a worker agent. That worker agent in turn would run PowerShell, and it would pull from GitHub or some other repo source all of my templates and use PowerShell to execute them. That's typically the way I would do it natively in Azure DevOps. Increasingly, and this is a pro tip, if you take nothing else away from this conversation, take this. Increasingly, what you are seeing organizations, especially large organizations, want to do is use Terraform. Terraform is extremely popular, especially with large organizations, and the primary reason why it's popular is because theoretically, I can describe anything anywhere using Terraform. So I can describe in Terraform what a virtual machine looks like in AWS, what it looks like in VMware, what it looks like in Azure, what it looks like in GCP, Google Cloud Platform. I can describe it. I can use a description in Terraform, a module that describes a virtual machine, and theoretically, therefore, based upon that one basic description, be able to deploy it anywhere I want, in any public cloud, any private cloud, and on-premises. As with most things that are described that way, it's, be careful of the snake oil you're buying. I wouldn't call Terraform snake oil, but I would say that rumors of its cross-platform support are exaggerated. Like all things, there are nuances and tricks. Not everything that Terraform can do is supported in Azure. In AWS, for example, you can do some things in AWS that you can't do in Azure, and vice versa. But that notwithstanding, that's a question of maturity. And it's very clear to me that the market, the IT market, especially the high-end IT market, the Fortune 500s out there, have identified Terraform as basically the best thing since Kubernetes. So you know how you can't swing a cat without hitting somebody who wants you to have Kubernetes skills. The next big thing, the thing that if you wanted to learn a skill, you would be able to start pretty much asking whatever you want for price, I would say is Terraform. If you are a skilled Terraform developer, if you demonstrate that you can write modules and configuration files and get them to execute well in a pipeline, you are going to have a job for a while yet. So if anybody out there is looking for a skill to get skilled up on that they think is going to be in high demand and you don't particularly think much of Kubernetes, I would really, really recommend looking into Terraform. It is a very hot commodity right now. I see a hand raised, but so I would use Terraform or something like that if I was going to deploy these as well, to answer your question directly. I see a hand raised, but unfortunately I can't see whose name that is, so my apologies. Oh, it looks like it's Jeffrey.
Hi there. I had a question mainly on tagging strategy versus
Sure.
policy. If this
Sure.
is off topic, feel free to stop.
Please.
But one of the things that we're trying to do is, rely on tags to specify, network access between, one resource or another. Do you have any experience with that, and maybe can talk about any, potential pitfalls or caveats that you've run into in, any of your deployments?
Sure, absolutely. So if I understand what you're trying to achieve correctly, what you're saying is asset A, I want to know the network relationship between this thing over here and that thing over there. So I want to know for this asset over here that's network connected, what is its connectivity to virtual machine A? What is its connectivity to virtual machine B? Do I have that right? Or
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Typically, I would not recommend using tagging to solve that problem. Now, keep in mind there's a $20 solution, there's a $5 solution, and there's a 50-cent solution. The challenge with using a tag I think you could do it. Don't get me wrong. Yes, you could say, I'm going to define a network group. I'm going to define a group of assets that should be able to communicate to each other, and I want to tag them so that I have visibility into the fact that they should be able to speak to each other. Absolutely, you could achieve that with tagging. My concern would be that's a configuration variable, really, and I think you need to be careful using tags to specify what the configuration on an asset should be. That's typically the solution I would have toward that. And I want to be real clear that this is a consultant speaking to you, not a guy who's actually got to do it. Typically, the advice that you would get from a consultant like me is for that sort of traceability. What is the network connectivity between device A and device B? I want to do that in a configuration management database of some sort. I want to have that in my ServiceNow catalog. I want to have that in something else that's tracking what the correct configuration of that asset should be. And if I'm using something like Terraform or the like, I can actually have a supporting file that describes that, right? So I can have in the deployment solution, not necessarily on the asset itself, but the deployment solution, some sort of record as well that indicates virtual machine A should be able to speak to virtual machine B. So that I would say that solution, the make a note of it and stick it in a spreadsheet, is the 50-cent solution, right? I don't know is that's largely unmanageable. The challenge with that is it comes out of date very quickly. More typically, the solution that I see organizations use to address network connectivity is some sort of NetFlow mapper. There are a number of tools that can do that. But so if the challenge is I need to validate that virtual machine A can speak to virtual machine B in my Azure presence, typically the way I would audit that is with Network Watcher. In the Azure tool Network Watcher, and just make sure that I can actually do it and actually see the latency and that sort of thing, and set up some sort of alert. I'd have that Network Watcher maybe pumping some of its telemetry to log analytics or the like, or doing something along those lines. So if my concern is I don't want virtual machine A to stop talking to virtual machine B, or I don't want any network changes to affect their ability to communicate with each other, I would then set up log analytics to basically capture when those two machines aren't capable of speaking to each other anymore via receiving telemetry from Network Watcher. And then I would basically create a logic app or the like that would surface to me an email saying, hey, virtual machine A can't talk to virtual machine B as of this particular date. And that would tell me, okay, I need to go and look at my deployments somewhere around that time to see who screwed up the network. That's the $5 solution. The $50 solution would be to use something like an IPAM solution. So using a full-fledged IP address management solution that includes things like DNS management and that sort of thing. I forget the name of the one that everybody uses. Anybody, if you know the name of the thing that I'm thinking about, it's something or other one, or I forget. It's called IPAM, IP address management. A lot of this particular solution I'm thinking of includes things like DNS routing and actual network latency management. Tools like that have the ability to also audit it has the ability to audit network change. You can use all that said, if what you're really saying is what I really want is to ensure that my networks are not changing without me knowing about it, that there's no changes to the network without somebody being alerted to it or a test being triggered. The way to do that, and I guess I would call this the $10 solution, it's probably the way I would really recommend doing this, is saying on everything, I'm going to create a policy, and what the policy is going to do is it's going to watch for any time, or I'm going to create an event trigger. I'm actually going to watch the activity log in Azure. I'm going to have it raise any single time, and I could do this with policy, or I could just do it with the event grid. With the event grid in Azure. I'm going to watch for any off the activity log. I'm going to watch for any time that somebody makes a change to a network security group, or deletes or changes a subnet. And if that change takes place, I'm going to audit whether or not it affects that change, that network security group change, or that subnet change affects either virtual machine A or virtual machine B, these two machines that have to speak to each other. And if that happens, I'm going to do one of two things. If I'm super sophisticated, I'm going to kick off some sort of ping test. I'm going to go ahead and kick off some sort of test that's going to say, hey, virtual machine A, make sure you can still talk to virtual machine B, and vice versa. And if you guys can't talk to each other, let me know. Alternative would be, I'm just going to go ahead and send somebody an email and say, hey, Johnny just changed the network security group rules for the subnet that virtual machine B lives on. You might want to go look and see, make sure that virtual machine B can still talk to virtual machine A. Long answer to a simple question.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but the big thing I'm trying to get at is like, the cloud's supposed to be dynamic.
Yeah.
If I have resources that are being spun up and spun down via like NSGs, they can understand tags, and we want to be able to spin up new resources, apply the tags, and have the NSG rules apply to those resources.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that is I think that's an interesting automation case, right? I think you can make an automation case for that. So if it's, I've got not necessarily a fungible environment, but it's an environment in which I'm bringing things up and occasionally getting rid of them. And what I want to do is make sure that I can provide, at the time that I execute the provisioning of that virtual machine, for example, I want to make sure that the network is completely ready for that asset to come, and that I may need to provide certain custom network rules to that asset. Yes, absolutely. In that case, that makes sense. If you can, especially if you can narrow the configurations to say a dozen or 15, if you could narrow the required configuration on that asset to, a manageable number of templates, basically, it's very easy to say at runtime, when I deploy this asset, I want something to inspect the asset, to pull the tag off of it, to pull the tag off it that says what its networking rules should be, or what rules I should apply to the NSG as a result of this machine showing up. And then I want some routine, some sort of service to go and make those changes. That's a very clear case for a logic app, and that's a very clear case for the event grid. So what I would do in that case is I wouldn't necessarily use a policy, although theoretically you could use a policy to do this as well. I would actually say I'm going to have a logic app. The logic app is going to listen for any single time that I create a virtual machine, and in that particular, that I create a virtual machine, it's going to go ahead, grab that virtual machine's definition, pull the tag on it that tells me what the network configuration should be. It's going to identify that correct network security group, and it's going to modify it. I might not actually be able to do that with a logic app now I think about it, but I could definitely do it with a function. So I might do it with a function instead, just because it's a little more flexible. But yes, there's absolutely an automation solution you can do there. And I might be wrong about this, but again, depending upon how you do it, you theoretically could use that same methodology to call Azure DevOps. So you could actually maybe even have a DevOps routine that responds to a webhook that gets fired off by the fact that the machine happens. And the value in that is you have it right there in your total deployment pipeline. So the same pipeline you use to deploy the virtual machine, you could use to manage the network settings as well, completely automated, based entirely upon the tag that you associated with the virtual machine that tells it what network configuration to apply.
All right, thank you.
It's complicated. If you want, I can quote you that, but it's going to be 6 figures. So it would take some time to do that. It'd be a couple months of project for somebody who knew what he was doing.
Looks like there's a question in there. Just SolarWinds question mark from Edgar. I'm not sure I understand what that is. Maybe you do.
SolarWinds, yeah. My apologies. Yeah. So SolarWinds is it's a software program, arguably the most popular software program that's used for what's called ITSM, so IT Service Management. So as we all know, something breaks, there's got to be a ticketing system of some sort, right? For example, there's got to be some means of being notified that a change or a break or something like that happened, and some sort of means of auditing the resolution of that request. So when you call, when somebody calls the help desk guy answers. SolarWinds is basically the database into which he enters your ticket, and he tracks the resolution of that. SolarWinds is more sophisticated than that. It has additional things in it. But basically when I'm talking about SolarWinds, I'm talking about arguably the most popular solution for tracking IT incidents and managing them and keeping record of them and identifying what they're used for. Again, the reason I keep repeating SolarWinds is because everybody uses SolarWinds. If you get out, there are other solutions. But much like there are other ways to do containers, everybody uses Docker. Much like there are many ways to manage container instances, but everybody uses Kubernetes. There are many ITSM systems out there, but everybody uses SolarWinds.
Awesome. Any further questions for Doug?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree, Edgar. SolarWinds has many problems. It is the worst thing you can do to SolarWinds is try to make it better. I am yet to meet the organization that's customized SolarWinds that wound up with what they were bargaining for. But again, it's what everybody uses. So while it's painful, at least it's painful for everyone. So when you go out,
we're also, the brand is also unfortunately tarnished due to one of the most notorious data breaches ever.
The data breach didn't do them any favors either. Agreed. Yeah. There are better, I would argue there are better programs out there too. And certainly it is, for most organizations, especially that aren't enormous enterprise orgs, SolarWinds is probably overkill. You don't need all the things it can do. Generally speaking, you'll be better off using something much simpler. But again, I just promise you that if you go and talk to any of the logos, if you see any organization with more than 50 people on the IT team, I've got $5 that says they probably use SolarWinds, or at the very least used to use it.
Right on. Okay. Well, last call here, I guess. And just a couple of reminders. One is you should definitely follow Doug's advice about policy and tagging. They work nicely together, and that will help you from being an example in our December 1st talk about Azure security problems. So we look forward to seeing you all if you're interested, on December 1st. That's the last event of 2021. And the video of Doug's excellent talk will be posted soon. It usually shows up the next day, and you'll be able to find it at youtube.com/Boston Azure. Great, thanks, Doug. This was fantastic. You took a topic that has a lot of loose ends to it, brought it together in a really coherent way, and really gave us a great explanation. Many thanks.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time.
Take care, everybody. Good night.